Welcome to the deep dive. We sift through stacks of research, pull out the key threads, and basically give you the essential context on complex historical topics. Today, we're diving into something huge, something that lasted for millennia but often gets overlooked: the Black Sea slave trade.
It really does. When people think of large-scale slave trades, they usually picture the Atlantic crossing, maybe the trans-Saharan routes.
Exactly. But the Black Sea, it was the central hub, a continuous one, for over 2,000 years, right from antiquity up to the 19th century.
A critical pipeline, really. It connected Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, all the way to the Mediterranean and the Middle East.
It's this immense story, and understanding it, well, it kind of reshapes how you see the connections between continents.
Absolutely. And its location was key. You have to picture the Black Sea historically sitting right at the edge of empires, on a crossroads of conquest, major trade routes.
Including the Silk Road, right?
Including parts of the Silk Road network, yeah.
Yeah.
It made it the perfect spot, geographically and politically, for funneling captives, people caught in wars, people sold out of poverty. It became this major collection and distribution point.
Okay, so that's the setup. For you listening, what we want to do in this deep dive is unpack this enormous history. We'll look at the four big eras: antiquity, the Byzantine and Italian period, then the absolutely massive Crimean Khanate trade,
Which was huge, yeah.
and finally that specialized Circassian luxury trade at the end. We want to
Again,
see how it evolved, who was targeted, and really the massive impact it had.
it shaped so much, particularly in the Middle East. Things like military structures, social hierarchies.
Okay, let's start way back. Antiquity, the Pontic Sea, as the Greeks called it.
Right, the Pontic Sea. And Greek colonies dotted the coastline, places like Olbia, Chersonesus. These weren't just settlements, they were crucial economic outposts.
And a big part of their economy was people.
A huge part. They were exporting human beings westward into the Mediterranean world, but also eastward, linking up with those early Silk Road networks.
Why was there such a demand from the Greek side?
Well, it ties back to their own internal laws. Think about Athens, around 594 BC, Solon's laws. They famously banned debt bondage, meaning Athenians couldn't enslave fellow Athenians anymore.
Okay. So if you can't enslave your own citizens.
Exactly. You need a steady supply of outsiders, non-citizens, barbarians, as they often term them. And the Black Sea region became a primary source for these barbarians.
So Greek legal changes fueled this external trade. And the supply came from the northern Black Sea shores. Our sources call it a slave coast.
That's a stark term, but yeah, pretty accurate.
Right.
That whole coastline was defined by instability. You had conflicts like Thracians versus Scythians. The Scythians particularly known for raiding.
And the locals got involved, too.
Oh, yeah. People living further inland, up the rivers like the Danube, they often acted as middlemen. They'd trade captured people to the Greeks in exchange for things they needed, like salt or manufactured goods. It was monetizing the chaos, essentially.
The scale, though. For antiquity, it feels enormous. Was it really that significant compared to other areas?
Well, if we trust contemporary accounts, yes. The historian Polybius, writing back in the 3rd century BC, he made a pretty startling claim.
What did he say?
He said the number of people shipped as slaves from the northern Black Sea was bigger than anywhere in the known world.
Wow. Bigger than anywhere. That puts the Black Sea right at the center of the ancient slave economy.
It really does. And this wasn't just a Greek phenomenon that faded away. When Rome rose to power, the trade continued. Those Greek cities became part of the Roman sphere, like the Bosporan Kingdom.
Roman client state, right?
Exactly. And its whole prosperity, we're told, rested on 3 things: wheat, fish, and slaves. It was a fundamental pillar of their economy.
So the Romans just took over the existing infrastructure.
Pretty much. Ports like Dioscurias in the Caucasus, Tanais at the mouth of the Don River, these remained massive export hubs. We find records of slaves from this region, Scythians, Paphlagonians turning up all over the Mediterranean. Even in Athens and Rome itself, Strabo wrote about it in the 1st century.
Then this links into the Silk Road, too. It wasn't just silk and spices then.
Not at all.
Hmm.
The Silk Road was absolutely a route for human trafficking, too. The northern branch especially. It created this channel from Central Asia.
From places like Bukhara.
Yeah, major slave markets there.
Yeah.
The route went across the desert, around the Caspian Sea, and basically funneled people towards the Black Sea ports.
So connecting Central Asian captives to the Mediterranean.
Precisely. Captives from Persia, various steppe groups, they could end up being sold in Roman markets via this Black Sea connection. The Byzantine Empire later became a huge customer, ensuring this whole system kept running for centuries after Rome's peak.
So the Black Sea wasn't just local, it was the endpoint of this vast transcontinental route.
A really critical final leg for a trade that had been going on for a very long time.
Okay, let's move forward into the Middle Ages. Things shift now, and religion becomes central.
Absolutely central. This is a fundamental change in how the trade is organized, you could say. Both in the Christian world and the Islamic world, a general principle emerged. Often broken, but still there.
Which was?
You shouldn't enslave your own co-religionists. Christians shouldn't enslave Christians. Muslims shouldn't enslave Muslims. But enslaving people of a different faith, that was generally considered acceptable by both sides.
Okay, so that immediately creates targets along religious fault lines.
Exactly. These slave zones pop up along the borders between Christianity and Islam, or between them and pagan areas.
Uh-huh.
And that leads to a really crucial point.
Who is the most valuable target?
Pagans. Definitely pagans. Because they didn't have religious protection from either Christians or Muslims.
Ah, so they could be sold into both markets.
Precisely. Maximum marketability for the trader. So, areas that remained pagan, like parts of Eastern Europe or the Caucasus for a long time, became prime targets. It wasn't the only source. Christians sometimes raided other Christians. Muslims sometimes raided other Muslims. The Mongols sold pretty much anyone but pagans. Were consistently the preferred commodity.
So how did the big northern trade routes, the Vikings, the Russes, fit into this Black Sea picture?
Well, the Vikings, or Varangians as they were known in the East, were masters of logistics when it came to this. They set up these incredible river routes, especially down the Dnieper River.
The route from the Varangians to the Greeks.
That's the one. They funneled thousands upon thousands of captives, Slavs, Finno-Ugric peoples, Balts southward toward the Black Sea, their main customer, the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople was a huge market.
And Kievan Rus' itself, the early Russian state, was built on this trade.
To a large extent, yes,
Yeah.
especially in its early days. Think of it as a state strategically positioned along these river highways. The Rus' rulers, originally Scandinavian, set themselves up to control the flow of goods.
Furs, honey.
Right. And people. Lots of people. They connected the populations of the northern forests with the merchants coming up from the Black Sea Byzantine Greeks, and also merchants coming via the Volga River from the Caspian, often Arabs. It was the economic engine.
You mentioned the term Sakalaba earlier, used in the Middle East for these slaves. It's often translated as Slavs, but it was broader.
Much broader, yes. It became this kind of catch-all term for slaves originating from Northern and Eastern Europe. So yes, Slavs were included, but so were Baltic peoples, Lithuanians, Finns, other Finno-Ugric groups. The term basically meant pale-skinned foreigner from the north.
Like a commercial category rather than a precise ethnic one.
Exactly. Simplifies the product.
Hmm.
And within that category, the Baltic region was crucial for a long time. It was one of the last major areas in Europe to remain pagan, right up until the 13th century or so. That made them a prime, legitimate target for raiding and enslavement by their Christianizing neighbors.
And when the Vikings eventually settled down, converted, and stopped the large-scale raiding, did the Baltic to Black Sea route die out?
Not entirely, no. Interestingly, pagan Baltic pirates themselves kind of took over parts of that route for a while. They kept the slave corridor open, selling captives eastward, eventually reaching the Black Sea markets. It shows how persistent the demand from the south was.
Okay, fast forward a bit to the late Middle Ages, the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. Demand picks up again.
Big time. Especially in southern Europe,
Yeah.
Italy, Spain, and also in Egypt. There's a resurgence after a bit of a decline in the 12th century. And then the Black Death hits in the mid-14th century.
Creating huge labor shortages.
Massive shortages.
Yeah.
And who steps into this vacuum? The Italian maritime republics, Venice and Genoa.
Right. The Byzantine Empire was weakening.
Especially after the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204. The Italians saw their chance. Venice established trading posts like Sudak and Tana, but the really big move was Genoa grabbing Kaffa in Crimea in 1266.
Kaffa, that name keeps coming up.
It becomes the center, the absolute hub of the Black Sea slave trade for the next 2 centuries. The Genoese and Venetians basically had a duopoly.
Where were they getting the people from during this Italian period?
Several major sources. One was the Caucasus. Genoese traders bought Abkhazians, Mingrelians, Circassians, often directly from local chiefs or sometimes even families selling their own children or relatives.
Sold by their own families.
Sadly, yes. Often due to extreme poverty or internal conflicts. Another huge source, especially earlier in this period, was fallout from the Mongol invasions. The Mongols captured vast numbers of people.
Like Russian peasants who couldn't pay tribute.
Exactly. And they happily sold them off to the Italian merchants in Crimean ports like Kaffa. This went on quite extensively until the Mongols themselves started converting to Islam and theoretically stopped selling Muslims.
And you mentioned poverty sales directly.
Yes, that seems to have been depressingly common, especially after the Black Death when desperation was high. Selling children, adolescents. It was a survival strategy for some, horrifying as it sounds. Sources mention Circassian nobles raiding neighbors and selling captives, but also selling their own poorer relatives if the price was good.
The destinations for these slaves showed a split, didn't they, based on gender?
A very clear split. The biggest single destination was Egypt, the Mamluk Sultanate. They needed soldiers.
The Mamluks themselves were originally slaves, right?
Many were, yes. They formed this unique military ruling class, and they constantly needed new recruits with no local ties. So Egypt imported huge numbers of boys, primarily from the Black Sea region, maybe around 2,000 a year during this period. These were the future Mamluk soldiers, the famous Bruji and Bahri Mamluks.
So the Black Sea trade was literally supplying the ruling class of Egypt.
For a significant period, yes. From the late 14th century onwards, the majority of the Mamluk elite originated from this trade. It's incredible.
But the slaves going to Italy and Spain were different.
Mostly girls, yeah, destined primarily for domestic services and maidservants, though concubinage certainly happened too. And these slaves reached the very highest levels of European society.
You mentioned the Medici connection.
Right, the story of Madalena. She was a Circassian slave, probably bought through Caffa, purchased in Venice around 1427. And she later became the mother of Carlo de' Medici, a prominent figure in Florence.
Wow. From a Black Sea slave market to the heart of the Renaissance elite.
It shows how integrated this trade was, even into wealthy European households. But this Italian dominance had an expiration date.
1475, the Ottomans arrive.
Exactly. The Ottoman Empire conquers the Genoese colonies, including Caffa, and this marks a huge shift. The Crimean Khanate, which controlled the hinterland, becomes an Ottoman vassal state.
And the slave trade becomes state policy.
Essentially, yes. It transforms into the main source of income for the Crimean Khanate. This wasn't just private merchants anymore. This was a state-sponsored, industrial-scale operation.
Why was it so central to them?
Well, the Khanate itself had limited resources. Small population, basic agriculture. Raiding and selling captives was, frankly, their most profitable enterprise. Partnering with the Ottomans, who controlled the massive demand setters, turned Crimea into a giant engine for capturing and exporting people. They even had a name for the raids.
The harvesting of the steppe. Chilling.
It is. And the scale of this harvesting is staggering. The Crimean Tatars, often with Nogai allies, launched these massive raids, usually twice a year.
Harvest time in winter.
Right. Targeting people working in the fields or when villages were more vulnerable in winter. They swept across huge areas. Southern Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Moldavia, Wallachia, the Caucasus.
How many people are we talking about?
The estimates are difficult to fully grasp. Some historians argue that, in terms of sheer numbers taken, the Crimean slave trade was actually comparable to the entire transatlantic slave trade up until the 18th century.
Comparable to the Atlantic trade? That's huge.
It really puts it in perspective. We're talking about a massive, centuries-long drain of people out of Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, running parallel to the early Atlantic system. And the primary commodity here was European.
Let's focus on the impact in Eastern Europe. Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine.
Devastating. Between 1500 and 1644 alone, just that century-and-a-half estimate suggests at least 20,000 people were captured every year.
20,000 a year.
Minimum. That totals over 1 million people just from that region in that time frame. It constantly destabilized the area, drained manpower. Defense against Tatar raids became a primary concern for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
There was that Polish proverb.
Yeah. Oh, how much better to lie on one's beer than to be captive on the way to Tatary. It shows the sheer terror and despair this threat instilled. And famous figures like Roxolana, who became Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent's powerful wife.
She was captured in one of these raids.
Believed to be, yes. From modern-day Ukraine, likely captured by Tatars. The number of Polish and Ruthenian captives was so high that Polish was apparently a common second language in Crimea.
And Russia. Was it the same situation?
Very much so, especially after Russia started expanding south and clashed more directly with the Khanate after the Golden Horde broke up. Between 1600 and 1650, maybe 150,000 to 200,000 Russians were taken. It was a constant bleeding wound for centuries. The last major raid was as late as 1769. During a Russo-Turkish war, took 20,000 captives then.
And this trade even pulled in victims from other conflicts, like the Great Northern War.
Right. During that war between Russia and Sweden in the early 18th century, Russian soldiers were apparently allowed to sell captives. They took Livonians, Finns, even Swedish civilians. Some of these ended up sold south into the Crimean network, eventually reaching Ottoman or even Persian markets.
So the system absorbed captives from wherever it could, and the central point for all this was Kaffa, Kife, as the Ottomans called it.
Kiev, yes, it was infamous. Described as an abyss where the blood of the region poured. Reports claimed it could hold something like 30,000 slaves at any given time. A massive human warehouse.
We have descriptions of the market itself, don't we?
We do. The Ottoman traveler, Evliya Celebi, visited in the 17th century and left this incredibly powerful, harrowing description.
Can you share a bit of that?
He wrote, "A man who has not seen this market has seen nothing in this world. There, a mother is severed from her son and daughter, a son from his father and brother, and they are sold among lamentations, cries for help, weeping, and sorrow."
Wow. It cuts through the statistics, doesn't it? The human cost.
Absolutely. Even an Ottoman observer was struck by the sheer brutality of families being torn apart right there in the marketplace. And it was all business, highly organized business.
How did the profits work? Who got what?
The Khanate had it systematized. The Crimean Khan himself got a cut, typically 10 or 12%, sort of tax, on every slave sold. Plus, a significant portion, maybe a fifth of all captives taken in major raids, were sent directly to the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul as tribute,
Reinforcing the vassal relationship.
and providing the Sultan with his own supply. The rest were sold off to merchants, who took them across the Black Sea to markets throughout the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, North Africa, the Middle East. Demand was insatiable.
What were the main uses for these slaves once they left Crimea? Men first?
A lot of hard labor, particularly agriculture.
Yeah.
But the really notorious use was as galley slaves, rowing the Ottoman warships.
That sounds brutal.
Incredibly brutal. The Ottoman Navy needed a huge number of rowers. Estimates run as high as 45,000 to 60,000 in the late 18th century. And Crimea was the primary source. Life expectancy was incredibly short. We hear accounts of captured Ottoman galleys where hundreds of slaves were freed, some having been chained to the oar for decades.
And the women. We touched on the preference for white slaves.
Yes, the Crimean trade was the biggest supplier of white women to the Ottoman world, and they were overwhelmingly destined for sexual slavery as concubines and harems, or sometimes wives. It was a status symbol for wealthy men.
Feeding the imperial harem, too.
Absolutely. The Sultan's harem in Istanbul, which could hold hundreds of women, was largely populated by slaves from this trade. And it wasn't just the Sultan. The entire Ottoman and Mamluk elite participated. There was often a preference among these elites for white concubines over African women, who were more often used for domestic service. It reinforced certain racial hierarchies within the household.
It sounds like just a mass market, but there was another system running alongside it. Ransom.
That's right. It wasn't all immediate sale into slavery. If the Tatars captured someone wealthy or important, they wouldn't sell them right away. They'd hold them for ransom.
For a higher price.
Oh yes, often double the market price for a slave. This required negotiation, specialized agents. Often people like Polish Armenians who knew the languages and had contacts in Crimea would act as intermediaries. They'd arrange the payment, and the captive would be released with a certificate of freedom.
So 2 tracks. Sell the poor, ransom the rich.
Basically, yes. Maximize profit either way. This whole massive system, the state-sponsored raiding, finally came to an end when Russia annexed Crimea in 1783.
But did the slavery itself just disappear overnight?
Not entirely. Even after annexation, thousands of people were still registered as slaves in Crimea well into the 19th century. The system had deep roots, but the mass abduction from the north stopped.
Yet, the Black Sea trade didn't completely die. It morphed, right, into the Circassian trade.
Exactly. The mass Crimean market was gone, but a more specialized trade continued, focusing almost exclusively on people from the Caucasus, primarily Circassians, but also Georgians, Abkhazians. They were shipped directly across the Black Sea to the Ottoman Empire. This lasted right up into the early 20th century.
The luxury aftershock, as our outline calls it. Why luxury?
Because these Circassian captives became an elite commodity. They commanded premium prices, sometimes 6 times higher than the next most desired group, like Oromo women from Ethiopia. There was this powerful cultural idealization of Circassian beauty in the Ottoman world.
And this trade focused mainly on girls.
Almost entirely on girls and young women, destined for concubinage or marriage within elite Ottoman households.
How did this continue, especially since many Circassians were Muslim by this point? Theoretically, they shouldn't be enslaving fellow Muslims.
This is where it gets murky and relies on justification narratives.
Yeah.
The common argument you heard in Ottoman circles was that these girls came willingly.
Willingly.
Well, that their parents, facing extreme poverty in the Caucasus, chose to sell their daughters. The idea was that this offered the girls a chance at a better life, potentially marrying into wealthy families, becoming wives of pashas, even ending up in the Sultan's harem.
So poverty and supposed social mobility were used to excuse the trafficking.
Pretty much. Often, the narrative involved girls being sold very young, then raised by the traders or brokers almost like foster daughters, educated and trained for life in an elite household, before being sold on often through what were essentially marriage brokers. It was a way to skirt the religious prohibition and maintain this open secret.
And these women were highly sought after.
Incredibly so. By the mid-19th century, almost all the consorts in the Ottoman imperial harem were said to be Circassian. They dominated the elite marriage market.
But Russia was expanding into the Caucasus during this time. Did they try to stop it?
Russia officially tried to abolish the trade as it conquered the region from the early 1800s through the 1860s. Their motives were mixed with maybe some genuine abolitionism, but also definitely about asserting control over the region and its profitable activities.
Did Russian actions have an impact?
They did. When Russia gained control of key ports after treaties like Adrianople in 1829, it significantly restricted the flow. Prices for white slaves reportedly skyrocketed in Istanbul and Cairo, showing how dependent the market still was on that Black Sea supply.
And the Ottomans faced pressure from Britain and France, too.
Yes, by the mid-19th century, European powers were pressuring the Ottomans to abolish slavery altogether. The Ottomans formally banned the white slave trade, specifically in 1854.
But was the ban effective?
Largely ignored. It was very difficult to enforce, and the demand remained high. In fact, just a few years later, in 1858, the Ottoman government issued regulations that basically taxed slave ships passing through the straits. Easier to regulate and profit from it than to actually stop it.
And then came the Circassian exile.
Yes, the forced displacement, some call it the Circassian genocide, in the 1850s and 60s. Russia expelled hundreds of thousands of Circassians from their homeland.
Where did they go?
Mostly into the Ottoman Empire. And they arrived as impoverished refugees. For many, the only way to survive was
To sell their children.
or the children of their own slaves, yes.
Yeah.
It created this tragic, sudden flood of Circassian girls onto the Ottoman market.
Which led to that really shocking market situation in 1856.
Right. The supply suddenly became so overwhelming that prices just collapsed. A white girl might sell for as little as 5 pounds, apparently, when just years before she might have fetched 100 pounds or more.
And this had bizarre consequences.
It did. There were contemporary reports, like one in the New York Daily Times, saying that because white girls became so cheap, some wealthy Ottoman men actually exchanged their more expensive black slave women for these cheaper Circassian girls.
Trading human beings based on fluctuating market prices.
Exactly. And the report adds this really disturbing detail that many pregnant black women were being sold off because, allegedly, infanticide of mixed-race children was common, and masters preferred white concubines. It's a grim snapshot of the racial and economic dynamics at play.
So even with official bans, the trade persisted.
Absolutely. It continued underground, often disguised as adoptions or arranged marriages, right up until the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I. There are even reports of white girls being trafficked into places like Kuwait as late as 1928, still using the marriage cover. It was incredibly persistent.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this vast history. 2 millennia. What's the big picture takeaway?
I think the main thing is just how central the Black Sea was. It wasn't peripheral. It was this constant engine generating and moving enslaved people for centuries upon centuries.
Driven by geography, by shifting religious ideas about who could be enslaved.
By state ambitions, like the Crimean Khanate, which basically ran on slave profits, and by relentless demand from empires in the Mediterranean and the Middle East.
And its effects were profound.
Absolutely. You can't understand the Mamluk military class in Egypt without understanding this trade. You can't fully grasp the social structure of the Ottoman elite, especially the harem system, without seeing this continuous supply of women from the north. It really reshapes societies.
So for you listening, the key is seeing this distinct, massive, and incredibly long-lasting human trafficking route running from Europe and the Caucasus into the Middle East. It complicates the picture of global slavery, showing a system where, for long periods, Europeans were the primary commodity.
It forces us to recognize that slavery wasn't tied to one race or one direction. It was driven by a power, opportunity, conflict, and demand, wherever those factors aligned.
Which brings us to a final thought. We've talked about the sheer scale, especially the Crimean trade rivaling the Atlantic trade in numbers until the 18th century.
Hmm.
If this system, primarily trafficking white individuals from Europe's frontiers, was so enormous and lasted for 2 millennia, why is it so often overshadowed in our collective memory? Why does the later, though also massive, focus on the enslavement of Africans seem to dominate the historical narrative so completely?
That's the question, isn't it? What does this massive omission, this historical blind spot, tell us about how we choose which stories of mass suffering and exploitation get remembered, get emphasized, and which get relegated to the footnotes?
Something to think about. How history gets written and what gets left out.
Definitely something to ponder.
We'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.